The Goodall family spent Christmas 1978 with family at Merrylands in Sydney. Then, on Boxing Day, 20-year-old Leanne travelled to Muswellbrook with her brother Warren and his girlfriend to spend a few days. Then, on the 30th of December 1978, Warren dropped Leanne off at Muswellbrook train station, where she was going to travel to Newcastle to spend the night at her mother's Belmont home. Then the next day, she was planning to travel to Sydney to spend New Year's Eve with friends and a few weeks down in Sydney with them. She never arrived at her mother's home, and nothing has been heard of her since that day. That was 46 years ago. This will be the first of 2 videos I will be making about the disappearance of Leanne Goodall, and I will cover such things as details of the events during the days leading up to her disappearance, including a report that could suggest that she may have changed her plans to go to Sydney for New Year's Eve, and her family didn't know about this. Then I will discuss how long it took for Leanne's family to realise that she was missing and to report that to police. I'll give some insights into Leanne's family background and the type of person she was. And I will, towards the end of this first video, I'll also cover how police responded to her disappearance and their lack of investigation at the time. For the second video, I will cover a report about an old school friend who says that she spoke to Leanne for about 10 or 15 minutes near the Star Hotel on the afternoon of her disappearance. Then I'll move on to a less credible report that Leanne was seen about a year later with Ivan Milat at Wyong Leagues Club. I'll also cover a phone call that occurred about 10 years after she disappeared, made to her family by someone who claimed that he was her husband. This will then lead on to a memorial service that was held in 2002 for Leanne, and I'll wind up at the end with some information on where things are at, and that the reward for information about her disappearance is still only $100,000. Then I'll give a bit of a discussion about my thoughts and opinions on what may have happened. Now, I did come across several articles about the events leading up to Leanne Goodall's disappearance. There are some discrepancies between the articles, but the general gist of events are pretty much the same. So I'll begin with an interview with Leanne's mother that is fairly detailed and also gives some background information about the family and the type of person that Leanne was. I won't read it all, and I will refer to some other articles as I go through it that are relevant. This article was in the Daily Telegraph on the 25th of September 2010. A mother's love will live forever. Beth Leen's sadness faces a cruel twist, writes Janet Fife Yeomans. The white and purple flowers in the cottage garden outside the front door are delicate, a bit old-fashioned, but surprisingly hardy. A lot like the lovely lady who planted them and who tends them. Beth Leen, 83, is a great-grandmother, immensely proud of her 6 children, her 4 boys and 2 girls. But there is a special place in her heart for one of them, the daughter who never came home. Even now, 32 years later, Beth still finds herself looking out the front door to see if Leanne is walking up the path, even though she knows that that is impossible. She was a lovely daughter who I will love forever, but we can't show our love for her because she's not here, Beth says. Since Leanne went missing on December 30, 1978, Beth has found a strength inside her she never knew was there. Like too many mothers before her and after her who are left grieving when their children die before their time. Beth has never been short of fortitude. Leaving her gambling and womanizing first husband when Leanne was barely 10. So this would have been around 1968. Beth brought up her 6 children by herself until she met and married Dan Leen in 1976, moving into his home in Belmont with its huge garden. I did a bit more research into Leanne's parents. Her father's full name was William Joseph Goodall. He was born in Coolgardie in Western Australia in 1927. It was once a major gold mining town, but by the time he was born, it had become a virtual ghost town. Leanne's mother, born Beth Audrey Christensen, was also born in 1927, but at Cobargo in New South Wales, which is a small town about 400 kilometres south of Sydney. Leanne's parents were married at Liverpool in Sydney in 1949. The 1958 electoral roll shows they were living at Gaythorne, a suburb of Brisbane, and it lists her father's occupation as soldier. Gaythorne borders the large Gallipoli Army barracks, so it is likely he was based there at the time. The 1977 and 1980 electoral rolls show he was living at Bondi in Sydney and working as a technician. The 1963 and 1968 electoral rolls show that Leanne's mother was initially living at Yarramalong, but had then moved to nearby Wyong in 1968. The move, I suggest, was possibly made at the time the marriage was ending. Now, I looked at marriage records and these show that in 1971, Beth remarried to a Ronald Frederick Portner. Now, it appears this marriage mustn't have lasted more than a few years, as it was reported that she met and married Dan Leen in 1976. Now, going back to the 2010 Daily Telegraph article, it continues, the children, Warren, Malcolm, Brian, Rod, Leanne and Pam, all kept their father's surname of Goodall, but Dan, 86, has been just like a dad to them. They all think the world of Dan. They tell him things before they tell me, she says. She hadn't heard from her first husband for years, until about 10 years ago, when his twin sister got in touch to say he was ill. She visited him in a Wollongong nursing home, and the family helped pay for his funeral soon after. Now, he actually died about 3 years before this article in January 2008 at the age of 80. That's the kind of people they are. Christmas 1978 was the last time they were all together. The family spent Christmas at Beth's sister's home in Sydney, more specifically this was Maryland's, and Leanne went back with her oldest brother Warren and his girlfriend to Muswellbrook for a few days. Warren, who was something of a father figure to his siblings, put her on the Sydney train that left Muswellbrook at 1:52 p.m. on December 30, a Saturday. Leanne intended going to Beth and Dan's home that night, and then she was off to Cromer on Sydney's northern beaches to spend New Year's Eve with friends. Now, the February and September 1977 electoral rolls indicate Leanne was living at Cromer then, so she may have only moved to Newcastle sometime during the year or so before her disappearance. At 3:30 p.m, Leanne got off the train at Broadmeadow and was last seen by a friend walking towards Newcastle's Star Hotel at about 4 p.m. The hotel was very popular with the young people, and Leanne loved to dance. She was a dancer, she could sing, she was clever and artistic, and everything a daughter should be, Beth says. When Leanne never made it home, Beth rang the friend in Cromer, hoping she had gone straight there. Then the family rang the police. Now, there are several other articles that report on these events, and while some of them provide additional details, others contradict them. But this is mainly just in minor ways. All agree that they spent Christmas in Sydney, and several specifically say this was at Maryland's. These other articles say it was with family or friends or both. And it seems it was at Beth's sister's home. So I expect it would definitely have been with family and possibly some friends as well. Now, while some of the other articles do provide additional information on Leanne's plans, there are some differences in what they were and who was aware of them. This then seems to lead to some discrepancies in when the family became aware she was missing and when the police were initially contacted. To discuss this a bit further, I'll start with a report that was in the Sydney Morning Herald on the 21st of March 1998, and it's headed Missing in Action. Leanne Beth Goodall should be celebrating her 40th birthday today, surrounded by those who love her. So she must have been born on the 21st of March, 1958. That seems to be, yep. You know, I still look for that young girl in the crowd when I go shopping, Mrs. Leen says of the last image imprinted on her mind of her daughter when she said goodbye with a kiss on Boxing Day 1978. Leanne had been with her mother visiting relatives in Sydney over Christmas and had decided to go and stay with her own friends in the city and see the new year in with them. But at the last minute, and without telling her mother, she changed her mind and went to stay with her brother Warren at Muswellbrook in the Hunter Valley. On Saturday, December 30, Warren saw her onto a Newcastle-bound train at 1 p.m. at Muswellbrook Station. The 2010 Daily Telegraph article actually said 1:52 p.m, but that difference may not be of any significance, and I expect it's probably when the train was due to leave Muswellbrook. Now it goes on. Leanne told him she intended to spend that night at her parents' home at Belmont and then travel to Sydney to celebrate the new year and stay a few weeks. So, if Leanne's mother didn't know she went to her brother's, it would mean that both her mother and brother would not be expecting to hear from her for at least a few weeks. Now, in 2025, we might think that's a bit unusual, but back then it wasn't really. To start with, people didn't have mobile phones, people weren't needing immediate contact. In fact, not everyone even had a phone at home. And if you were outside the local call area, like the lower Newcastle Lower Hunter area was a call area, the cost of phone calls were timed and could be expensive if you talked too long. Especially if you're calling on a public phone, it made things a bit more difficult, and you need to keep a good supply of coins to keep feeding the phone. So if you were away from home, it was not unusual that you would only call back if you needed to. The article goes on. 2 weeks would pass after Leanne left her brother Warren before Mrs. Leen realised her daughter had disappeared, never making it to Sydney or to Belmont. It came about when Warren paid her a visit and asked about Leanne's stay. After establishing from friends in Sydney that she had not been seen, Mrs. Leen went to Newcastle Police Station and reported her daughter missing. So the implication from the 2010 Daily Telegraph article was it was probably the day after she went missing that police were contacted. But this article suggests it was not until 2 weeks later. On the 21st of June 2001, the Newcastle reported on the appearance of backpacker killer Ivan Milat, who was a person of interest, at the inquest into the disappearance of Leanne Goodall, as well as that of Robin Hickey and Amanda Robinson. He provided little, if any, useful information, but at one point he leaned forward, staring at the families, and said, "I was mystified when I read about one person who went missing in December, and they didn't report her missing till February." So, with her going missing in December, that would be referring to Leanne. And I suspect he may have got the idea that she went missing, that she wasn't reported missing until February, from a Daily Telegraph article that appeared about a week before his appearance in court, and this was on the 13th of June 2001 with the headline, Milat, a key to missing women. In this article, it says Leanne was reported missing on February 7, 1979. So, from these various newspaper reports, we have three possibilities as to when Leanne's disappearance was reported to the police. These being possibly the next day, being the 31st of December 1978, 2 weeks later, which would be sometime around the 13th of January 1979, or February 7, 1979, which was 39 days, or nearly 7 weeks after she went missing. Now, it seems likely the family thought Leanne would be away for a few weeks. So I'm doubtful that she was reported missing the next day. In my personal opinion, her disappearance being reported 2 weeks later is the most likely of those three options. Now, perhaps the February 7 date was a mix-up by the newspaper, and perhaps it was actually January 7. They may have been getting confused with when she was meant to start her studies, which would have been February 12. Now, January 7 is only 8 days after Leanne went missing, but it is 12 days after the last time that her mother saw her, which may be where the 2 weeks come from. Alternatively, it seems police were initially reluctant to investigate, and perhaps they didn't record the family's initial reports and didn't make a formal record of the report until February 7, 1979. But before I do discuss the initial police report, I will discuss evidence reported by one witness that could suggest Leanne changed her mind about travelling to Sydney for New Year's Eve. Now, this was reported in the Sydney Morning Herald on the 20th of June 2001. And it says, Mrs. Wendy MacDonald told the inquest yesterday she received a phone call from Goodall a few days after Christmas 1978, saying her bag and wallet were stolen and she could not attend Mrs. MacDonald's New Year's Eve party. Now, I've not seen this reported elsewhere, so it could be misreporting by the newspaper, but the details are very specific. So, assuming it is true and she couldn't attend the party, it implies she couldn't attend the party because she couldn't go to Sydney as planned. It's not definite, but yeah, so I could be wrong, but yeah, it seems a bit odd. And as it's not reported elsewhere, the question does arise, was anyone else aware that Leanne's bag and wallet had been stolen? If not, perhaps the few days after Christmas was the day she disappeared. This could suggest it may have occurred after she was last seen, and that Mrs. MacDonald could have been the last person to speak to her. It would seem even more unusual if no one else was aware of the theft and she had called Mrs. MacDonald before the day she disappeared. Otherwise, perhaps Mrs. MacDonald was mistaken, or Leanne was telling her a little fib for some reason. Perhaps she made other plans and didn't want to offend, but I suspect not. Whatever the case, this short paragraph does seem to raise a lot of unanswered questions that could change what we know of the circumstances leading up to Leanne's disappearance. But anyway, moving on, I'll get back to the initial police response. I'll firstly provide a summary of their response by returning to what is said in the Daily Telegraph article of the 25th of September 2010. They kept saying she would be all right. She would be home, Beth says. Leanne had the whole world ahead of her. She had her 21st birthday party planned for March 1979. A talented painter, she was excited about starting at the Arts College in Newcastle. The family knew she would not have run away, but the police wouldn't take them seriously. Every few months they would call around and ask if she was home yet, Beth says. Their investigation was almost non-existent, and their offhandedness was later slammed by State Coroner John Abernathy. Appropriate missing person cases are now routinely investigated as homicides, and an unsolved murder squad was formed. But anyway, the Sydney Morning Herald on the 21st of March 1998 went into a bit more detail about the initial police investigations. After establishing from friends in Sydney that she had not been seen, Mrs. Leen went to Newcastle Police Station and reported her daughter missing. 2 officers at the station took down the details and a description, and there the matter would rest for up to 3 months. Actually, it was probably longer than that. There was never any search. They, police, treated her as a runaway and just kept saying, when I called that she'll be back. Occasionally they would ring and ask, is she back yet? But that was it. Then one day in late April 1979, Mrs. Leen read with alarm in a local paper about the disappearance of 2 teenage girls from Belmont and Swansea. Now I expect this would be the front page newspaper article in the Newcastle Herald on the 23rd of April 1979. Similar to Leanne's disappearance, 18-year-old Robin Hickey's disappearance on the 7th of April was treated as being a runaway and not considered with any more significance until 14-year-old Amanda Robinson's disappearance 2 weeks later. So it goes on to say that Swansea, less than 3 kilometres south of Belmont, now technically I guess the northern part of Swansea may be 3 kilometres south of the southern point of Belmont. But from the Goodall home to where Amanda Robinson disappeared in Swansea is more like 8 kilometres. But that's just a technicality. Goes on, by then she had been pushing police to no avail for publicity in the media about her daughter. In the end, she took her plight to the Newcastle Herald, and only then did Leanne's disappearance become intertwined with the fates of the other missing girls. Now, I'm not sure when Leanne's disappearance first got reported in the Newcastle Herald, but I have recently been going through the 1979 Newcastle Herald articles to look for further articles about the disappearances. But so far I've only covered from the 23rd of April up to the 25th of June, and while I found a few more articles about Robin Hickey and Amanda Robinson, I haven't found anything mentioned about Leanne Goodall. And the articles I have found I will report on in a future video. And while I've tried to be thorough in looking, I might have missed something about Leanne Goodall, but I don't think so. But anyway, the earliest article I have found mentioned in the Newcastle Herald with Leanne Goodall was on the 11th of November 1980. And all it really says about her is they, meaning police, will renew investigations into the disappearances of 2 other Newcastle girls, Leanne Beth Goodall, 20, of Lambton, and the other one being Annie Tomanak. Now, at this time, it was believed the last known sighting of Leanne was when her brother Warren dropped her off at Muswellbrook train station. But this changed in October 1997, so nearly 19 years after her disappearance, but I'll discuss this in my next video. The final article I'll cover in this video reports on the evidence given by Leanne's mother and 2 of her brothers at the inquest into her disappearance. This was reported in the Newcastle Herald on the 19th of June 2001, and it gives a few more insights into Leanne's personality, as well as family accounts of the circumstances leading up to her disappearance. It starts off, "My 23 years of pain, Mum tells of lost girl," by Greg Vent, or it could be Went. At times, fighting back tears, Mrs. Leen told the coronial inquest of the heartache of searching for her loved one for 23 years. Mrs. Leen said family members became concerned when they rang friends and discovered Leanne had not made it to a party in Cromer in Sydney to celebrate New Year's Eve 1978 with friends. "We realised something was wrong when no one had seen her," she said. "She was so excited about starting her arts course at college, and every time we heard a car pull outside the house, we thought, that's Leanne back to start her course." She was to start college on February 12, 1979, not long before her 21st birthday. Mrs. Leen and Leanne's siblings, Warren, Malcolm, Brian and Pam Mitchell, recalled an attractive, independent young woman who enjoyed dressing in good clothes to go out. She was like a bird, free to go where she wanted, Mrs. Leen said. She was very close to us and loved by her family and friends. The court heard that Leanne went to a family Christmas get-together at Maryland's in Western Sydney and told her mother she was going to spend a few days in Muswellbrook with big brother Warren. Now, this contradicts the 1998 Sydney Morning Herald article, which said she didn't tell her mother. But if Leanne did tell her mother, she probably said she was going to Sydney after that anyway, and that she would be there for a few weeks. Either way, it seems likely her mother and brother were not expecting to see her for a few weeks. Mrs. Leen told the inquest that on Boxing Day 1978, she said goodbye to Leanne. I never saw her again, she said. Warren recalled enjoying the few days in Muswellbrook with his sister before putting her on a train at the station to return to Newcastle. That was about 1:15 p.m. on December 30, Mr. Goodall said. Now that's another time for dropping her at the station, and I don't think it really matters, but probably just best to assume it was some time between 1 and 2 p.m. that day. I was the oldest of the 6 kids, and Dad died when I was 11, so I sort of took over the role. Now, that's not actually right. Their father was actually still alive and didn't die until 2008. So it was probably when their father was no longer part of their lives that he took over that role. Perhaps the journalist just misunderstood or misquoted Warren, or perhaps Warren just thought it was easier to say he died rather than explain the whole situation, which would probably not have been of any relevance to the inquest. I told her I hoped she got stuck into her arts course, and we were all very proud of her going to college. She was in a happy frame of mind. Malcolm Goodall, so that's Leanne's other brother, I think he's the second oldest one, said he and Leanne used to hitchhike to the Doyleson RSL Club and Budgie Hotel together before the family moved from the Central Coast to Newcastle. Now, from other articles, it does seem Leanne was a prolific hitchhiker and was hitchhiking quite a lot, and a lot more than her mother knew, and she wasn't happy with that. And so it would seem that it wouldn't be unusual for her to accept a lift from a stranger. So I consider it's a plausible possibility that she may have accepted a lift from someone to go to her mother's place sometime after arriving in Newcastle. Then says he and Leanne shared a flat at 7th Street, North Lambton, but Leanne was also known to go back to her mother's house at Red Rose Avenue, Belmont, to stay regularly. Malcolm Goodall said Leanne did not arrive at Lambton the day she disappeared. Whilst I've not seen anywhere that she was expected to go to Lambton. I assume this was just to eliminate the possibility that she might have changed her mind and gone there instead of her mother's home at Belmont. The inquest will hear from a witness that she saw Leanne at the Star Hotel on the evening of December 30, 1979. Detective Senior Constable Peter Jenner told the court the woman, who was the last person to see Leanne, was a very credible witness who knew Leanne from high school. Now, I'll discuss this evidence in my next video about Leanne's disappearance. But before I end this video, I will finish up with an NBN television news clip from June 2001, where Beth Leen says what she hopes to be the outcome of the inquest.
We're hoping that we will get some kind of an answer and we can lay them to rest.
Sadly, when the inquest concluded in 2001, the only answer that they could give about what happened to Leanne was that she was murdered by a person or persons unknown. And unfortunately, no further answers were forthcoming before Beth Leen died in 2012. And her husband, Dan Leen, died about 2 years later in 2014. In my next video about the disappearance of Leanne Goodall, I will discuss the report by an old school friend of Leanne's that she spoke to her for about 10 or 15 minutes near the Star Hotel on the afternoon of her disappearance. And then I'll go on to a less credible report from someone who says they saw Leanne about a year later, that's after her disappearance, with Ivan Milat at the Wyong Leagues Club. And then I'll give a report on a phone call that was made to Leanne's family about 10 years after her disappearance by someone who was claiming he was her husband. I'll also give some information about a memorial service that was held for Leanne in 2002. And then I will discuss where things are at now, including that there's still only a $100,000 reward for information regarding her disappearance. To be notified when I upload this next video or any other future videos, please subscribe and click on the bell. I hope you found this video interesting and informative, and if you'd like to support me to make more, you can do so at Patreon. I'm David A. Elliott. Have a good one and see you around. Like a whistle.